Hello everybody, I am the Friendly Englishman and this is part 7 of Seer. Before we dive back into the story, I will attempt a very quick summary here just to go over what's happened so far and to help you orientate yourselves a little better. The story starts with the discovery of the Wormstone, which is a form of corrupted warpstone that causes any who touch it a brutal death. Its location has been discovered deep underground by Skaven. Cratch, a Skaven Seer apprentice, betrays his master, kills him in a cave-in, trying to steal the Wormstone, but loses the stone as a result. We are then introduced to Hans Dietrich and his gang in the city of Altdorf. Through luck or perhaps misfortune, Hans and his gang stumble across the Wormstone in the sewers beneath the city of Altdorf. They take it back with them, narrowly escaping the gangster Gustav Volk, who is after them. This is where we meet Thanquol, the protagonist of this book. He is in Skaven blight and in a bad situation. He has to fight for his life to avoid the punishments of the Lords of Decay, who are the rulers of the Skaven world. Thanquol manages to escape the maze-like prison they put him in to die, and is allowed to serve the council once again. They want him to retrieve the Wormstone, also deal with some treacherous Skaven upstarts in the Undercity of Altdorf. Thanquol sets off with 2 white albino stone vermin bodyguards and Cratch, his new apprentice, who has also been sent to spy on Thanquol by the council. We start to see the disease the Wormstone brings and spreads in the city of Altdorf, causing quite a few horrific deaths, and the looming viral outbreak is set to devastate Altdorf. We meet Theodor Bayer, captain of the Watch, as he begins to investigate the events around the Wormstone, and he is also interested in Dietrich's gang and begins to follow them. Theodor has a mysterious master that he is working for who has not yet been revealed. Dietrich and the surviving gang members are trying to sell the Wormstone to Dr. Lowe, an alchemist, but he does touch some of it and we begin to see the disease spread to him. And Thanquol then arrives at Under-Altdorf and begins to search for the stone. There are a lot of schemes were introduced amongst the Skaven of Under-Altdorf, and we learn of Clan Pestilence being one of the most active, and we do see the arrival of Lord Skrolk himself. Thanquol also survives an assassination attempt by Clan Eschen, and dealing with their assassins with his epic magic as he continues to close down on the location of the Wormstone, and that is about it so far. I hope that will suffice. This is the start of Chapter 6, The Wizard and the Monster. Seer Thanquol stood within the cavernous warren, perched atop a lump of stone, overseeing the frantic efforts of his underlings as they scoured the floor of the abandoned cave. Their objective was to gather small slivers of blackish-green stone, the tiniest of fragments of the missing Wormstone. These toxic flakes were scattered throughout the warren, forcing the Skaven to scour every nook, dig under every bone in their search. The effort was made all the more complicated by the warp bat's refusal to have anything to do with the unnatural debris, anxiously cringing beneath the legs of its beastmaster every time an effort was made to include it in the hunt. After a time, even Thanquol gave up trying to induce the animal to cooperate. If it wasn't so valuable, and if he didn't need the goodwill of Clan Moulder, he would have ordered his storm vermin to gut the rebellious vermin. None of the scouts sent by Clan Eschen had survived the skirmish and assassination attempt, though they had taken most of the clan's pestilence contingent with them. Chantor Pusscab was among the casualties, a Skaven dagger nestled in his chest. Whatever strange revelation he had wanted to impart to the Seer locked on his dead lips. The knife in Pusscab's chest looked terribly familiar to Thanquol, and he felt uncomfortable when he recalled throwing knife that had missed him and the death squeak that had followed when the weapon struck a very different target. Pusscab and several of the other plague monks had been gathering strange wormy growths from the floor of the cavern. The things had a weird, pungent smell that reminded Thanquol equally of warpstone and sewage. Even so, the plague monks had thought the things important enough to collect, so Thanquol bit down on his squeamishness and ordered Cratch to gather them together. Cratch wasn't overly pleased by the task, quickly bullying some clan rats into doing the work. The studious way Cratch avoided touching any of the dried, crumbly worms was not lost on Thanquol. Anything his apprentice avoided coming into contact with was worth keeping in mind. Later, when there were not so many listening ears, he'd have some questions to put to Cratch about the Wormstone and Scarbrit's ill-fated expedition. The fate of the Wormstone itself was soon explained. Some of the clan school contingent found faint prints in the dust of the floor, the mark of boots. Humans had been here, and judging by the depth of some of the tracks when they had departed, they had taken something very heavy away with them. Of all the clans, Skål and Eschen had the greatest contact with the human nest above Under-Altdorf. Knowing the disfavour and distrust with which Thanquol now regarded Clan Eschen, Clan Skål was quick to offer its services tracking down the errant humans. Their spokesman, an old, crook-backed spy named Scrim Nortail, promised that Skål's network of informants, partners and pets among the humans of Altdorf would quickly locate the men the Grey Seer needed to find. With Thanquol's blessing, Scrim Nortail sent one of his younger, sprier subordinates to make contact with Skål's agents on the surface. Thanquol watched the wiry Skaven scurry from the warren, rushing down the black passageways beyond. "These shards," Fiskit Bernthang was saying, one of the flakes of stone gripped in his iron-sheathed hand. "They are strange. I would like to examine them further." Thanquol looked at the warlock engineer, studying his posture and scent for any mark of deceit. He was perfectly willing to allow the warlock engineer to suffer the hazards and labour of experimenting with the wormstone residue. He was less than willing to let such discoveries slip into the paws of Clan Scryer. He gave Bernthang a threatening smile of fangs. "Perhaps we could study it together," he told the warlock engineer, lifting his head to remind Bernthang of his superior authority. There was no reason not to allow Bernthang to do all the work. He could always suffer an accident before any report could find its way back to Warlord Quilisk. Before Thanquol could make more detailed ideas about how to exploit Bernthang's skills without risk, a sharp squeal of terror rose from the passageway behind him. The Grey Seer spun about, his eyes going wide as he saw an enormous creature waddling out of the darkness. Its scent was sickly, a foul mixture of decay and disease laced with, yes, a suggestion of warpstone. The reek of fresh blood, Skaven blood, was heavy about the monster, stemming from the ugly smear splashed across its massive jaws. Gigantic, rat-like, its foul eyes gleaming with hunger and madness, the rat beast crept slowly forwards, a rope of bloody drool spilling from its fanged mouth. "Rat beast, still live!" Cratch's panicked shriek echoed through the cavern. The adept dived behind a pile of bones, spurting the musk of fear. Thanquol watched the display of terror. The private discussion about what exactly had happened to Scarbrit was going to be very interesting. The rat beast growled in response to Cratch's scream. It shook dirt from its mangy pelt and loudly sniffed at the air. Its claws crunched against the floor as it continued to creep forward. Thankwell hopped down from his perch and started to back away. He smelled the horror in the scent of his underlings, disturbed to see them retreating even more rapidly. The grey seer forced himself to stand his ground, straightening his posture and raising his head. He glared at his minions, showing his fangs. Angrily, he pointed at the slowly advancing monster. "Kill, kill!" he snarled. The command didn't seem to impress his underlings. When the rat beast suddenly swung its huge head around and bit through a clan school ratman trying to sneak past it, many of them began to squirt their own fear smell. Thankwell ground his fangs together. The craven filth. Their cowardice was threatening his own welfare. He closed his eyes, drawing upon some of the divine power of the horned rat. A leprous glow began to gather around the metal head of his staff. The display of Thankwell's sorcery turned the crisis. His underlings had seen a recent and dramatic display of the Grey Seer's awful power. They knew the havoc and carnage he could visit upon them with his magic. Thankwell gloated as the warriors of Clan Moors and Clan Scab began to form up into ragged ranks. As the armed clan rats of Scryer began to scurry and creep into positions from which they could employ their ghastly weapons, it did not matter if they feared the rat beast. All that mattered was they feared Thankwell more. The muster of the Ratkin was not lost upon the rat beast's feral brain. The monster roared as it saw the warriors form into ranks. Then it was charging across the cavern, a pounding, surging mass of crushing bestial fury. The beast smashed into the warriors of Clan Moors, battering them with the violence of an earthquake. Broken bodies were flung into the air as the beast ravaged the ranks of the warriors, oblivious to the swords and spears stabbing into its polluted flesh. Squeaks of terror and cries of mortal agony rose from the brutalized ratmen, filling the abandoned warren with a fearful clamour. The stink of fear was drowned out by the reek of spilled blood and ruptured bodies. Thankwell swung about. The rat beast's charge had moved it away from the passage, the one exit from the cavern. Snapping quick orders to those around him, Thankwell led a quick retreat, careful to keep his white-furred bodyguards between himself and the rampaging beast. Other Skaven were quick to join the exodus, abundantly content to leave the warriors of Clan Moors to distract the monster. Thankwell led his minions across the cavern, the crunching of bones and the shredding of flesh echoing behind them. It was wisdom, not cowardice, to avoid a senseless fight with a mindless monster. It was more important that he bring his discoveries back to Under-Altdorf than risk himself destroying some brainless brute lurking in a forgotten warren that had been abandoned generations ago. His subordinates would support his position, at least those who made it out. Thankwell looked back to see the rat beast feeding on the fallen warriors. It was a gruesome, hideous sight that made the Grey Seer's glands clench. While he watched the monster feed, Thankwell saw something leap up from the floor and begin a mad dash for the tunnel. It was Cratch. Abandoning his improvised refuge, scent dripping down his legs, the rat beast noticed the adept's sudden movement. With live prey to pursue, the monster ignored the carrion crushed beneath its paws. Growling, the brute lunged after the scurrying Cratch. A timely tumble spared Cratch from the beast's lunge. Sprawled across the floor, Cratch cowered as the monster's bulk swept through the air above him. Thankwell snickered when he saw his apprentice's dilemma, but his amusement quickly died when the rat beast's pounce carried it past the prone adept. Landing past its intended prey, the beast did not bother to look around for Cratch. Instead, its beady eyes focused on the Skaven fleeing into the tunnel. It was just like Cratch to treacherously refuse to allow himself to be eaten so his betters could escape. Thanquol shoved Burnfang out of his way as he resumed his headlong flight down the passage. The White Stormmen kept pace with him, using their halberds to batter and smash any Skaven in their way. Behind him, Thanquol could hear the shrieks of ratmen as the beast ploughed into them, crunching their bodies against the earthen walls. The grey Seer risked a look back, horrified to see the rat beast rushing down the passageway only a few yards away. He fumbled at his robe, paws closing around another piece of warpstone. Despite the immense danger of drawing upon such power again so soon, Thanquol was determined it was better than being chewed by a giant monster. Burnfang's shrill voice squeaked above the roar of the monster and the screams of mangled Skaven. Thanquol did not catch the Warlock engineer's words, but one of his guards did. Seizing the Grey Seer by the waist, the storm vermin crushed their charge to the floor. Thanquol spit dirt from his mouth, about to snarl an outraged protest when a chemical smell filled the tunnel. With a whoosh, the gloom of the passage was annihilated by a surge of dripping flame. The liquid fire of warp fire throwers. Skaven shrieked as the flame licked at their bodies, searing through flesh and to fur to gnaw the bone beneath. At the front of the tunnel, a clan scryer weapon team stood its ground, their slick oiled smocks resisting the back spray from their weapon. They played the flame across the tunnel, heedless of whether the fire struck Skaven or beast, their sadistic laughter ringing out. Laughter turned to screams as the monster came racing down the tunnel, its side engulfed in flame. Agonized, maddened, the rat beast charged the source of the fire rather than fleeing it. The brute's mass smashed into the weapon team, dashing both of the rat men against the walls. The burning monster did not pause to finish its foes but continued on, rushing down the winding tunnels. Moments later, Thanquol could hear a faint splash as the scorched creature dived into the stagnant muck of the human sewer system beyond the Skaven tunnels. The Grey Seer pushed the clinging arms of his bodyguards from him and lifted himself to his feet. Brushing dust from his robes, Thanquol dispassionately surveyed the carnage in the tunnel. Mangled and broken Skaven picking themselves from the smoking wreckage of their fellows. He ground his fangs together as he saw Cratch stepping gingerly through the gore. "I think you forgot to tell me a few things," Thanquol hissed at his apprentice as he came closer. Cratch started to stammer out some sort of excuse, but Thanquol was in no mind to hear his lies. A quick smash of his staff into the adept's gut crumpled Cratch in a grasping heap on the ground. "You can trust me, Mouse. No less than authority than Dr. Lowe confirmed its wordstone." Kemp stood within a cluttered curio shop, surrounded by shelves bulging with pieces of rusty armor, notched blades, mouldy garments decades out of fashion, cracked pots, dented tankards, and the leering bosom of an old ship's figurehead. The building was less store than it was rat-run, narrow little aisles winding their way through heaps of old junk and almost trash. One glance at the motley collection, the gathered hoard of a pack, racked rather than the wares of a merchant, the observer might be forgiven for cultivating a belief that the proprietor would buy nearly anything brought into his shop. It was a calculated deception, for the owner of the shop was notorious for his shrewd business sense and miserly souls. Bitter and sharp, Hopfoot the Mouse was far from the happy, heathenistic halflings of the moot. Frugal to the point of deprivation, as judgmental as the warden of the Reichsfang, as vicious-minded as a goblin war chief, many stories and rumours circulated about the waterfront regarding Hopfoot's past. The halfling's twisted leg was blamed on everything from an extreme case of Orcus shingles to a bad fall when he pulled himself out of a giant's cookpot. The reasons for his exile from Mootland were even more speculative. Some said he'd murdered his father to claim an inheritance, had been forced to flee with the field wardens hot on his hairy heels. Others said he'd committed the unforgivable crime of stealing recipes from the Bakers Guild and had been tarred and feathered before being run out of the moot on a rail. Whatever the true stories, Hopfoot kept them as close to his chest as the tiered ring of money belts that hugged his plump frames. The halfling was fingering one of those belts as he eyed the green-black shard the smuggler had placed on the teakwood counter. There was a foxy, suspicious gleam in his eyes as he lifted his head and squinted at Kemp. "If Lowe thinks this stuff is Weirdstone, why don't you sell it to him?" Kemp chuckled. "He's an alchemist. You're a fence. You have more ready money than he does." Hopfoot patted the steel barrel of an enormous blunderbuss, its mouth looking wide enough to swallow the Emperor's palace. It was one of many such weapons secreted about the confusing jumble of the curio shop. In the past, enterprising burglars had thought the diminutive fence would make an easy mark. It was said the halfling had sold their bodies to the medical catechists at the university. Their clothes would be some of those quietly decaying on the dusty shelves. "I have more money because I'm careful with it," Hopfoot warned. "Not all thieves use their hands. The clever ones try to use their tongues." The fence's voice dropped to a sinister snarl. "You aren't clever now, are you?" "Don't threaten me, mouse," Kemp snapped, reaching out to retrieve the stone shard. The halfling's nimble hands quickly pulled it from the man's reach. "I can just as easily sell it to Lowe." Hopfoot grinned, fingering his jeweled money belts again. "You are a terrible liar, Kemp. If you were going to sell to Lowe, you wouldn't have come here. Besides, as you so eloquently observed, I have more money at hand for such expenditures." The halfling stared at the greenish rock again. "Tell me, why don't you want to sell to Lowe? Worried that he might have spoken with Gustav Volk?" "Volk doesn't concern you, mouse," Kemp stated, reaching for the shard again. The halfling leaned away from his clutching hand. "He's looking for you, you know," Hopfoot said. "You and all your friends, offering a tidy sum, too." The fence made a placating gesture with his hand. "I buy and sell goods, not information. Ask around. Anyone will tell you that Hopfoot's memory is absolutely awful." The halfling's smile broadened. "But maybe it isn't Volk who you are hoping to avoid. Does Hans know you're making a side deal?" "For a fellow with a bad memory, you've got an ugly tongue," Kemp growled. Before he could move, Hopfoot had his arms around the blunderbuss, raising it menacingly above the counter. "Let's keep things professional, shall we? Any transaction we agree to stays between the two of us. Discretion is, after all, the heart of good business." The halfling set down the wide-mouthed gun and picked up a stick of lead from the counter. Writing on a strip of water-stained parchment, he began to make calculations. After a few moments, he set down the lead and pushed what he had written towards Kemp. "I trust you can read numbers, if not letters." Kemp's face grew flush, his fingers crumpling the parchment. "What are you playing at, mouse? This isn't half what Dr. Lowe would pay for a good piece of weird stone like that." "Then see Dr. Lowe. Or maybe talk to the Dietrichs about your little side deals. How much of the stuff have you skimmed already, I wonder? Enough to make Volk the least of your problems?" "Stop baiting me, you poisonous little toad." Hopfoot's smile dropped into a thin, friendless sneer. "I'm just making certain we understand one another. Discretion, after all, doesn't come cheap." Think of it as an added custom or duty. A bit less profit for you, and Hotfoot's memory remains as bad as the roads in Stirland. Nobody needs to know you ever came here. Or why. Glowering at the fence, Kemp gave a reluctant nod. Hotfoot opened one of the pouches on his money belt and began counting out silver coins. The smuggler watched the little stack of silver rise, all but drooling over the piled money. Absently, he began to scratch at his arms, twitching as he did so. The fence noticed the motion and he gave Kemp a knowing look. "How long has it been since you visited Otto Alley?" Hotfoot's smile grew back into its former broadness when he saw the alarm seize Kemp's features. "Don't worry. If I can't remember where you were, I can't very well know where you are going, if anyone asks." The halfling laughed as Kemp quickly grabbed the fistful of coins and darted down the cramped aisles of his shop. "Come again?" Hotfoot called after the smuggler. He heard the little bell fastened to the door jingle as the man retreated into the street. He stared back at the green stone in his hand, laughing to himself as he considered how much he could sell it for. Always a pleasure to help those in need of discretion. Grey Seer Thanquol stalked through the cramped streets of Under-Altdorf, his albino storm vermin clearing a path for him through the press of mangy, furry bodies. The streets of Under-Altdorf, like those of any Skaven warren, were narrow and winding, designed so that those who scurried along them could feel the reassuring presence of solid earth against their whiskers. Stenches and smells inundated the priest-sorcerer, an almost overwhelming stink of musks and scents. Here in the market scroll of Under-Altdorf, every few feet of tunnel bore the musk of a different individual, as merchants and trades rats marked their shops and stalls. Dingy signs, often no more than a rag drenched in the odour of the proprietor's wares, stabbed out from the tunnel's walls, denoting some little wooden stall or the sunken entrance to a more permanent establishment. Large banners hung over the entrances to the side tunnels, and connecting passageways proclaiming the clan affiliations of those merchants to be found in that stretch of the market. Sometimes, though rarely, Thanquol even saw signs bearing the scratch marks of written Queekish, though literacy was considered something of an unattainable extravagance by much of the teeming masses that scurried through the marketplace. Thanquol patted the heavy bag he bore, and his tail twitched in satisfaction. He had turned the fiasco in the old warren of Clan Moral into a victory, one that only a Skaven of his keen and discerning intellect could have achieved. Playing one clan against the other, he had been quick to accuse each of being behind the plot to assassinate him. Thanquol was not sure he believed Scratch Scarpaw's insistence that if Clan Eshin had wanted the Grey Seer dead, they would never have been foolish enough to use their own rat men to accomplish the deed, but it made for a most effective argument to keep the other clans nervous and jumping at the shadows. Each had been most eager to show their loyalty to Thanquol and, more importantly, the Lords of Decay in Skaven Blight, by lavishing the Grey Seer in gifts and promises. They could keep the promises. Thanquol might not be convinced of Scarpaw's innocence, but he was far from satisfied that none of the others were guilty. He included Grey Seer Thrakwi in that suspect group. The old villain was probably just impatient enough to try and kill Thanquol even before the Wormstone was in their paws. Thanquol wasn't about to accept further reinforcements from the clan leaders. The remains of his first retinue, those who had survived the attacks of the assassins and the rat beast, were enough for his purposes, and more importantly, could be reasonably assumed not to have been involved in the plot to kill him. They didn't smell of treachery, or at least Thanquol could try to convince himself they didn't. If they thought he trusted them, they'd let their guard down and be easier to watch. Gifts, however, had been much more welcome. Each of the clans had tried to outdo the others in financing Thanquol's changed mission. A small fortune in warpstone tokens now rattled in the dwarfskin bag slung over his shoulder, enough to rebuild the fortune he had lost trying to pursue his foolish vendetta against that damnable slayer and his manling pet. There was even enough that he could spend part of it on what was intended for without feeling the bite too keenly. It would certainly help keep up appearances as far as the council was concerned.
"Most merciful and wise master,"
Cratch's whining voice sounded from beside Thanquol. The Grey Seer turned to see his apprentice's head bobbing submissively at his elbow.
"Allow this wretched underling to carry your onerous burden."
Thanquol gave the adept an incredulous stare and clutched the bag tight against his chest. "When orcs fly," the Grey Seer answered. Ever since they had left the council chambers, Cratch had been grovelling and snivelling, trying to get his paws on the swag Thanquol's craft had won. The adept's manipulations might be as transparent as a broken window, but his tenacity was becoming tedious. All the Skaven the rat beast had gulped down, how was it possible the nasty thing had missed Cratch? Surely it was some trial sent by the Hortoned rats to test Thanquol. The only thing that gave him pause was a nagging doubt that he might still need his apprentice to identify the wormstone when it was found. That, and concocting an elaborate enough lie about Cratch's future accident that the Council of 13 would accept. Thanquol was pulled from the happy thought of several inventive and torturous ends for his apprentice by one of his albino guards. The hulking armoured Skaven bowed before the Grey Seer, his posture bespeaking the new respect and both fear Stormvermin had been displaying ever since his brutal destruction of the assassins. If Thanquol had even considered intimidation would work on the elite warriors, he'd have tried it long ago instead of bribery and deception. The white-furred Stormvermin waited until Thanquol acknowledged him, then lifted a paw and pointed at the bright yellow and blue banner stretched across a nearby tunnel entrance. The rune scratched across its surface in what smelled like a particularly septic sort of blood proclaimed it as the demarcation for Clan Moulder's section of Under-Altdorf Scroll Market. Thanquol's tail twitched and a feral gleam came to his eye. When he had told the council he did not need more rat men to serve him, he had, of course, meant minions provided by the clans. If he was to master the Wormstone, he would need to experiment with the pitiful remnants recovered from Clan Maul's abandoned warren. For that, he would need test subjects. Many test subjects. The slave masters of Clan Moulder and Clan Skull had ample stocks of shackled wretches to be had for a few warpstone tokens. Clan Skull specialized in human slaves, starveling drug fiends abducted from the nests of humans above Under-Altdorf, the dregs and detritus of the largest concentration of humans in the old world, the nameless and faceless who were barely missed by their fellows. Thanquol had already negotiated the purchase of a few score of these manlings to test the effects of the Wormstone upon. Before he returned to Skavenblight and presented a weapon before the Lord of Decay, it would be advisable to make sure it worked first. Clan Moulder, however, specialized in Skaven slaves, miserable rat men whose clans had been conquered and vanquished, the survivors becoming a commodity to be traded and abused by the victors. In his audience with the council, Thanquol had explained he would need a control group of Skaven to test the Wormstone on, and to see what safeguards would be required to make it safe for the ratmen to handle. Skaven slaves represented the cheapest and most expendable way to conduct controlled exposures and develop countermeasures. Viscit Bernfang was even now ransacking the shops of Clan Scry's engineers for the equipment Thanquol would need to make his experiments. He knew he would not need to fear any subterfuge from Bernfang. The Warlock engineer would be heading the experiments himself, and any sabotage would strike down him before the Grey Seer. No Skaven, however large the bribe or threat, could be bullied into sacrificing himself. Of course, Thanquol's real motive in testing the Skaven slaves was not to find a way to protect against the Wormstone, but to see how potent it was against his own kind. Some of Thrakqui's grandiose scheming hadn't sounded completely insane to Thanquol. As a weapon against the humans, the Wormstone would represent power for the Council of 13. As a weapon against Skaven, the Wormstone would represent the might of Grey Seer Thanquol. The tunnels of Clan Moulder's section of the scroll were wider than those elsewhere, the ceiling stretching higher than the comforting closeness of the other traded districts. Thanquol knew it was practicality rather than aesthetics that had caused such a divergence in construction. Many of the strange beasts bred by the Master Moulders were much larger than even the biggest Skaven, and such lumbering brutes needed the extra space if they were not to become lodged in the passages. 1,000 new smells assaulted Thanquol's senses, odours of corruption and suffering, bestial stenches, and the reek of raw meat. The shops that loomed from the walls of the tunnel were larger than elsewhere, expanded to accommodate the living wares of the merchants. Iron cages and wattle pens were everywhere, smashed into every nook and cranny. Wherever a beast master or slaver could squeeze his property and set up an auction block. The gloating, bullying voices of the merchants chittered through the passages, alternately whining and threatening, using a bizarre combination of enticement and intimidation to draw custom their way. The throng that packed the tunnel was a motley array from all across Under-Altdorf. Clan Sleekit barge masters scurried through the press, eagerly negotiating for more slaves. Fat hedonists of Clan Skull bartered in their shadows for weird, mind-warping elixirs and powders from garishly robed beast breakers. Warlock engineers prowled through the crowds, their bodies bent beneath masses of strange machinery. Little strings of servants scurrying after them with baskets bulging recently purchased rats. Towering above the mob, immense rat ogres stalked along the passages like walking mounds of muscles and claw, doggedly following in the tracks of their colourfully cloaked masters. Sight of the huge monsters brought a new thought to Thanquol. His eyes narrowed as he looked at his white-furred guards. Their performance against the assassins had been less than zealous, and he could not forget that however much they might fear him now, their loyalty still ultimately rested with the Lords of Decay. He needed protection of a more dependable sort, the kind that didn't scheme behind his master's back or plot intrigue with his enemies. He turned his eyes away from the tunnel ahead, instead training his attention on the shops and pens they were passing, sniffing at the air and trying to pick from it the scent he was looking for. After a dozen twists and turns of the tunnel, a feral smile came to the Grey Seer as he found what he was seeking. Raising his staff, Thanquol motioned to his underlings to precede him into a cave-like shop that gaped in the wall of the passage. The reek of beasts and meat was overpowering as the Skaven stepped from the corridor and into the dimly lit shop. Metal cages hung from the ceiling, displaying a variety of oversized rats with an outrageous array of mutations twisting their verminous bodies. A big wooden mew stretched across one of the shop's walls, its cramped interior filled with a colourful collection of bats, a popular pet and status symbol for affluent Skaven. Thankful ignored the bats and rats, turning instead to the far side of the store. Here, a deep pit had been excavated, lined with wickedly barbed iron spikes. A thick, brutish smell rose from the hole, and he could hear the rumbling breath of some gigantic creature.
Greetings, greetings, Holy One,
the proprietor of the shop chittered as he crept towards Thankful. He was a small, large, fanged rat man with strange streaks of red in his fur. A variety of whips and leashes dangled from the copper belt that straddled the merchant's paunch, clattering against his belly with each waddling step.
How may humble honoured Shafwit be of service to terrible Grey Seer Thankful?
The storm vermin bared their fangs when they heard Shafwit address the Grey Seer, lowering their blades menacingly. Thankful waved them back. As much as he approved of this display of paranoid caution, it was not surprising that the merchant should recognize him. Word of the presence of so renowned and respected a personage as himself would have spread to even the lowest levels of Under-Altdorf by this time. Moreover, the frightened scent and submissive posture of Shafwit was too compelling to be trickery. An old-handed deceit, Thankful knew an amateur's smell. Thankful did not answer the merchant, instead pushing past the runtish ratmen, stalking towards the pit. He peered over the side, his beady eyes narrowing with greed as he saw the thing below. A thrill of fear rushed through the Grey Seer's body, teasing at his glands. His muzzle spread in a fierce smile. The fear he felt would be nothing beside that which would grip the craven hearts of his enemies. Cratch slithered up beside his master, his conniving curiosity pulling him after Thankful. The adept peered down into the pit, cringing back as the thing below looked back. The apprentice's feeble valor abandoned him and he began to creep away. Perhaps, grim and horrible biter of throats, this one should scurry seek the slave meat for your studies. If Great Master Thankful will allow favour poor Cratch with a few hundred walkstokens to make take from the slavers. Steal your tongue and your feet, Cratch, Thankful snarled, or I will nail both to the floor. He gave his apprentice a glower that ensured there was no doubting the sincerity of his threat. Turning away from the subdued apprentice, Thankful rested his paws against a fence of metal spikes and grinned down at the occupant of the pit. It was a colossus of bone and muscle, every inch of his massive frame boiling with barely restrained violence and bloodlust. Taller than 3 Skaven, 6 feet across at its broad shoulders, weighing as much as the barge he had travelled to Altdorf on, the thing in the pit seemed more like some elemental force than a beast of flesh and blood. Its leathery flesh was pale and pitted with vicious scars, the visible heritage of a brutal and savage life. Patches of stringy black hair dripped from the massive body, its scaly tail dangling behind it. Its tail as thick around as one of Thankful's legs. A massive head filled with yellowed fangs the size of daggers sprouted from the broad shoulders, bestial and rat-like with a dull, murderous intelligence shining in its bloodshot eyes. The beast's arms were enormous concentrations of knotted muscle and thick bone, each ending in a fist bigger than a Skaven's head, each fat finger tipped with a sword-like claw. The imposing limbs were made even more menacing by the disparity. A mutant, the thing sported a third arm, its right shoulder splitting to accommodate the extra extremity. It was, quite simply, the most monstrous rat ogre Thankful had ever seen, and when he saw the giant, spear-like horn growing between the brute's eyes, he knew the creature was meant to be his. It was a sign, an omen from the horned rat, a sacred protector to guard the god of vermin's favourite and most devout servant. Thankwell had used rat ogres to protect him from his enemies in the past, the first having loyally and fearlessly sacrificed itself upon the axe of that thrice-damned slayer in order that its master might escape. In need of a dependable guardian, Thankwell had come to know the scrawl foremost to procure a rat ogre bodyguard. After one look at the hole in the pit, he knew no other beast would do.
"What price for the beast?"
Thankwell asked, his eyes locked on those of the monster in the pit.
"Dread mighty Thankwell," Shufflewit whined. Expensive, much cost to unlucky Shufflewit to feed and keep such fearsome stock."
Thankwell's eyes narrowed, his fangs gleamed in a challenging smile.
"How much?" "It will kill each Shufflewit's other rat ogres," the merchant explained, spreading his paws in a helpless gesture.
The irritating habit of Under-Altdorf's Skaven to adopt human mannerisms set Thankwell's fur bristling, darkening his mood and collapsing his already fragile patience.
Name a price while it is still a tongue inside your snout," he warned in a low snarl. "For 400 warp tokens, merciful and fearsome Thankwell," Shufflewit stammered.
Thankwell turned his head away from the merchant, looking instead at the white storm vermin. He gave a twist of his horned head, and the two warriors seized Shufflewit, pushing the merchant to the lip of the pit, pressing his body over the spikes. Below, the mutant rat ogre watched the spectacle with rapt and hungry attention.
The 370 warpstone tokens,"
Shufflewit pleaded. A flick of Thankwell's claw had the storm vermin push the merchant a little further over the edge.
"So 354 warpstone tokens, 353, 320.
Seer Thankwell listened to the merchant rattle off prices. Eventually, he could reach a fee that reflected the proper amount of respect and admiration for Thankwell's position and prestige. Until then, Thankwell returned his attention to the pit. The rat ogre looked back at him, the smell of Shufflewit's fear provoking a rope of drool to fall from his immense mouth.
20 warpstone tokens,"
Shufflewit shrieked. Thankwell chuckled, motioning for his mute storm vermin to pull the merchant up from the pit. It was a miserable-looking Shufflewit that grovelled and fawned before the Grey Seer. "Hey, the wretch," Thankwell barked at Cratch. Looking almost as miserable as Shufflewit, Cratch dug a pawful of coins from his own rat-skin purse. Scowling at his miserly master, Cratch threw the coins at Shufflewit, the little discs of warpstone scattering across the floor. The merchant dived after them, scrambling about on all fours to recover his money. The albino storm vermin used their wiry strength to drag a heavy beam from one corner of the shop and tip it over the side of the pit. They glanced down into the depression, then hurriedly retreated, scurrying after the halberds they had set leaning against the wall with almost as much indecent haste as Shufflewit scrabbled after his coins. Behind them, the beam groaned and shook as something immense clawed its way up from the darkness. The horned rat ogre's head just peeked above the lip of the pit. All three of its immense claws dug into the wood of the beam, streamers of drool dangling from its fangs. Thankwell felt a tremor of fear as he felt the rat ogre's beady eyes stare at him, but the monster had small interest in his new owner. It was the sight of Shufflewit, still scurrying about the floor for his fee, that seemed to incense the monster. With a tremendous blow, it exerted the massive strength of its powerful frame. The beam splintered and cracked as the rat ogre lunged from its perch, clearing the pit and crashing to the floor of the shop. Shufflewit had just enough time to recognize the vengeful paw that came smashing down to grind his skull into the ground. The other Skaven backed away from the monster as it continued to pour slivers of meat from the merchant's corpse, flinging them from its claws with an almost noble contempt as it continued its bestial retribution. Thankwell saw the indecision in the eyes of his bodyguards, their halberds shaking in their paws. The longing look they gave to the doorway was eloquent in its expression of cowardly treachery. Thankwell lashed his tail in spiteful annoyance, his anger only swelling when he heard Cratch yelp as his master slapped him across the snout. Thankwell turned a baleful eye on his apprentice, furious at the temerity of any minion to cower behind a master in crisis. Anger and a good pinch of warpstone snuff fueled the Grey Seer's contempt for all and everything around him. He straightened his back and stormed across the shambles of Shafwit's shop, being careful to step over the spreading pools of the merchant's blood. Thankwell stalked directly toward the raging rat ogre. Angrily, he brought the head of his staff smacking into the monster's snout. The brute reared back, a deafening roar rumbling in its lungs. All three arms raised over his head in readiness to crush and maim. Thankwell just glared back at the beast, no suggestion of fear seeping into his scent. The monster stared into Thankwell's glowing eyes. The arms drooped slowly to its sides. Jaws snapped close as the rat ogre's expression faded from one of exultant rage to cowed timidity. A subservient scent poured from the beast's glands. Thankwell turned from the subdued rat ogre and snarled at his own cowering minions. Let them fear. He was better than them. That was why he was destined to be the greatest Skaven who ever lived. Even a dumb brute like a rat ogre recognized the might of Grey Seer Thankwell. With their own heads lowered in humility, the storm vermin crept forwards. Cratch, with one eye still fixed on the rat ogre, began to paw among the mangled meat that was the remains of Shafwit, looking for warpstone tokens. Thankwell drank in their fear as though it were a sweet perfume. It was not the rat ogre they feared, but the Skaven who was able to command such a beast's loyalty through force of will alone. He would name his new property Bone Ripper, Thankwell decided. No matter how many times he used it, the Grey Seer felt there was an appealing menace to the name, a promise of the horrific savagery his guard would unleash on his command. The Black Bat was one of the many establishments on Altdorf's notorious street of 100 taverns. It was well outside of Theodore Bayer's normal hunting grounds, being close to the university and well away from the docks. However, swathed in a heavy leather coat and with his pectorals stuffed inside an inner pocket, Theodore wasn't an unofficial business and didn't need to worry about stepping on the pride of the local watch, responsible for this stretch of the capital. He was not visiting the Black Rat in his capacity as a sergeant of the City Watch. His visit here was more important than his normal duties, orders not from his captain, but from the invisible being to whom he owed his ultimate loyalty. The tavern was crowded, even at midday. The long beer hall that was the Black Bat's common room was bisected by a rectangular counter of sombre Drakwald timber, polished to a remarkable shine. The counter formed a little island amid a sea of oak tables and beechwood benches from which the barman could minister spirits and beer to the thirsty throngs who rolled around them, crashing like waves. A trap door beneath the beer barrels led to the cellar beneath the tavern, allowing the workers to replenish supplies without pushing their way through the masses of patrons. Most of the clientele of the Black Bat were labourers, teamsters and mule skinners, stonemasons and carpenters, roofers and plasterers. Odd pockets of students from the university slumming from their usual haunts, were scattered among the tables, keeping as much to themselves as was possible in such crowded conditions. At a glance, Theodore could see the styles of Marienburg and Nuln, the rich fabrics of Estelen pantaloons, and the frilly extravagance of Tillian shirts. Threadbare wool tunics from Wissenland and wolfskin boots from Middenland. Long Kislevite beards mingled with swarthy Merigalian complexions. At one table, Theodore could see a dusky Arabian horse trader boisterously arguing with a Bretonnian sea captain. All roads lead to Altdorf was a common saying in the Empire, and nowhere could tell the truth for such an assertion be better displayed than in the city's taverns. Theodore turned away from the noise of the hall, looking instead to the stairs that rose from the tiled floor. These led up to a wooden deck that circled and overlooked the hall below. Climbing the stairs, he found the upper floor divided into small booths, separated by partitions, affording each occupant a level of privacy impossible in the room below. Each of the niches held a table and several straight-backed chairs. A candle provided each alcove with illumination, dispelling the shadows that threatened to consume them. Theodore marched past the alcoves, studying each face he passed. The occupants, mostly wealthy businessmen and buxom wenches too young to be their wives, ignored the sergeant as he stalked the hallway. At the end of the walkway, just as the raised floor made a turn to the right, Theodore noticed an anomaly, an alcove that seemed somehow out of place. Appointed just as the others, the light of the candle was somehow weaker than those elsewhere. Where the other private booths had been bathed in light, this one was lost in shadow. The sergeant felt the hairs on his neck prickle as he stepped towards the niche. His mind suddenly gripped by a thrill of alarm and uneasiness. The air felt colder as he leaned into the alcove, his breath misting before his face. "Be seated," a low or whispering voice spoke from the gloom of the apparently empty alcove. Startled, Theodore could do nothing except obey the commanding tone. As he started to settle in one of the chairs, a long-fingered hand swathed in charcoal-grey gloves emerged from the shadows, gesturing for him to take the chair to his left. Theodore turned and sat where the pointed finger indicated. He glanced at the hall below, noticing that his original position would have obscured the speaker's view of the Black Bat's main entryway. The gloved hand vanished back into darkness. Straining his eyes, Theodore could not make out so much as a silhouette amid the patch of shadowy blackness. An instant later, the hand reappeared, tossing a token down the table before him. Theodore heard the clank of metal against wood, looking down to find that the token was a coin-like square of metal, its face engraved with a strange, squirming characters and a device he could only liken to a snake's skull wearing a feathered headdress. His eyes had only a moment to register the weird talisman before the gloved hand dragged it back into the shadows. Even so, he knew it to be the sign that he had been instructed to look for. "The report," the chilling voice in the darkness told him. Theodore licked his lips nervously, knowing now that he sat in the presence of his master rather than another minion such as himself. The dead man was Emil Kleiner, a small-time smuggler, part of Hans Dietrich's gang. The body was burned, the tenement where it was found quarantined, as per instructions. Dietrich's gang. Progress in finding them. Theodore found himself glancing away from the darkened corner, even though he could not see the face of his investigator. No progress. There was a fight between Hans Dietrich's men and those of Gustav's folk 5 nights ago. Dietrich has been lying low ever since. Many in the gang have been killed by Volks's men. Known survivors? The chilled voice's clipped words hissed from the gloom. Dietrich and some of his gang were seen in the Orkanax the same night as their fight with Gustav Volk. Poorly treated wounds on several of the men make it likely this occurred after their encounter with Volk. In addition to Dietrich and Kleiner, the others present were Dietrich's brother, Johann, Bogdan Kemp, Max Wilhelm, and Nicholas Müller. I have issued orders to the soldiers in my district to look for these men and detain them on sight. Countermand those orders. The men are not to be detained or followed. Sightings of any of them are to be reported. Take no further action until otherwise instructed. Theodore sat in silence, considering the strange commands he had been issued. The importance of finding the smugglers was something that he could not doubt, and which he had been certain had been impressed upon his master. The new instructions seemed to betray that urgency. A rasping sound, like the rustle of scales against cloth, hissed from the darkness. More importance must be placed on following and observing these men than catching them, at least for the moment. Nothing must be done to put them even more on their guard than they already are. Other operatives will take up the vigil. You will stand by with your men and be ready to act when indicated. I obey, Theodore said, relieved by his master's explanation, but now more perplexed than before. He knew, of course, that there were other operatives in service to the master, but he wondered who could be better qualified to watch the waterfront than the men who patrolled it day in and day out. Dismissed, the voice hissed from the shadows. Theodore rose from his seat and bowed. Turning away from the table, he started to walk back across the platform. As the sensation of unnatural cold passed from him, he looked back at the alcove where he had sat in conference with his mysterious master. The sergeant stared in dumbfounded wonder. Where the alcove had been, there was now only the outer wall of the Black Bat. A single window looked out over the street behind the building. By some sinister art, the little alcove had been conjured into existence in a place where it could not exist. As many times as he had experienced the abrupt vanishment of his master, the watchman could not keep his skin from crawling and his blood from turning cold in his veins. Theodore backed away from this evidence of dark powers, turning his thoughts to more clean subjects, such as murderers and smugglers, as he quickly descended into the main floor of the Black Bat. Even in the light of day, there were some things a man feared to dwell upon. Kemp stumbled on the stairs as he exited the little tea shop and descended into the building's cellar. He always stumbled, his excitement overwhelming his coordination, overwhelming everything, in fact. Hans Volk, the watch. Nobody and nothing existed as far as Kemp was concerned. All that mattered now was his descent into the cellar, the magical place hidden beneath the shop. His eyes barely registered the growing gloom of the poorly lit landing at the base of the steps. His nose didn't even notice the musky, cloying stink that rose to meet it. His ears didn't trouble themselves by trying to make sense of the muffled voices that could be faintly heard. What little concentration Kemp was able to drag away from the excruciating anticipation that gripped his mind was focused upon the steps beneath his feet. A hulking man with arms thick enough to strangle an ox greeted Kemp at the bottom of the stairs.
Back for more, eh, scum? Didn't take you long, did it?
Kemp had to crane his neck to look into the guard's scarred visage.
I want to see Otto Ali,
he said, licking his lips as he spoke. The guard poked a finger into Kemp's chest, pushing the weasel-like man back onto the stairs.
I don't think the boss wants to see you,
he grunted.
Please,
Kemp whined. stepping down to regain the ground he had lost. "I must see Otto Ali." A massive hand slapped against the leathered length of a thick-bladed broadsword. "Go drown yourself, rat," the guard growled. "No layabouts and no charity. Beat it before you start to annoy me." Kemp dug frantically into his tunic, dragging out the little leather pouch Hotfoot had given him. He opened it, displaying the coins for the guard. The thug grunted appreciatively and fumbled a few coins from the purse. "Well, I didn't say you could pay," the guard muttered, stepping aside and allowing Kemp to strangle past him. Beyond the guard was a thick oak door. Kemp gave a practice knock against the wooden panel, a series of raps and taps that would allow him entrance to the lair of Otto Ali. The door opened, and a glowering brute, every bit as large and imposing as the outer guard, looked Kemp over from head to foot before motioning the little man inside. Within was a brick-lined grotto, its exact dimensions hidden by shadow and a litter of wooden bunks crammed into every inch of the main floor. The smell of human sweat and urine was too strong for even Kemp's distracted senses to ignore. The delirious moans and mumbled words rising from the bodies sprawled on the bunks, too persistent to escape his ears. A few old lanterns, their glass cracked and caked in grime, flickered from rusty chains set in the ceiling, casting a feeble glow upon the drug den. "You come to visit us again, my friend?" A thickly accented voice beamed. Kemp's heart fluttered like that of a young lover in the presence of his paramour. He turned quickly to face the speaker. The man who had addressed him was a swarthy, his complexion darker even that of Attilian. Oily black locks, their lengths curled and stringy, draped down across his thick brow. A smarmy smile split his broad face, displaying teeth that matched the thick gold rings piercing his ears. The man's attire was like his lineage, a curious mixture of the Empire and far distant Arabi. A wide sash circled his heavy gut, while foreign slippers with curled toes covered his feet. The mixed-blood Arabian laid a heavily jeweled hand on Kemp's shoulder, like an old friend, rather than a man who had used violence to eject the man from this very cellar only the night before. "More gold, and so soon!" Otto laughed, knowing that the smuggler would never have penetrated this far into his establishment if he was still as destitute as when he had left it. Kemp handed him the pouch Hotfoot had given him for the shard of weirdstone. Otto Ali poured the contents into his hands and tutted. "Only silver," he sighed. Kemp's shoulders sagged, his face falling into a mask of despair. "Still," Otto Ali mused, "this should be enough to buy a few dreams, small dreams," he added when he noticed the joyous relief that seized the smuggler. It would not do to raise the man's hopes too high. That might lead to another ugly scene, such as the previous night. Otto Ali clapped his hands together, and a thin servant joined the two men. A long-stemmed pipe was in the servant's hand, and Kemp could barely contain himself as the minion led him away towards one of the bunks. Otto Ali started to follow, but a sharp voice demanded the Arabian's attention, pulling him into one of the drug den's many dark corners. Kemp dismissed the proprietor from his thoughts. Dismissed everything, in fact, as the servant poured a pinch of shiny black powder into the bowl of the pipe, then pressed the stem into the smuggler's lips. Another servant, one of the few trusted to carry an open flame in the den, manifested beside the bunk and placed a candle beneath the bowl. After a moment of smouldering against the river clay bowl, the contents of the pipe began to vaporize. Greedily, Kemp drew the flames through the pipe and into his body. Dreams gripped Kemp. Dreams such as the smuggler preferred to his bleak reality. There was only one distraction as he slipped into the visions filling his mind. Something was snuffling close beside his bunk. Something like a big, stinky dog. It was too much effort to turn his head and see what it was, so he drew another lungful of vapor into his body. Voices came to him. One was thin and scratchy. The other was Otto Ali's. "Take watch, human meat," the thin voice chittered. "Smells scent like warpstone. No, warpstone. Maybe might?" "This man is a good customer," Otto Ali objected. "If I keep him, I can't get more of his silver." "Take watch," growled the voice. "Take watch or no black dust for Ali man. We pay shiny ore to Ali man." "I can give him more black dust," Otto Ali mused. "He'll dream for days. But why do you want him?" The scratchy voice laughed. A weird, trilling sound that was ugly enough to almost pull Kemp from his drugged indolence. "Not want find. Thankful want find. Thankful grey Seer. Reward much. Use human meat. Find take maybe warpstone. Thankful reward much. A shabby-looking gutter snipe in tattered coat and scuffed boots. There was nothing in the appearance of Ludwig Rothfels, that made him stand out among the shambling crowds that filled the streets of Altdorf, pushing and squirming their way through narrowing streets choked with unwashed masses of humanity. There were hundreds of his ilk creeping through the busy market squares and thoroughfares of the capital, waterfront vagabonds stealing forth their habitual squalor to rub elbows with their betters. Beggars and thieves, cut-pursers and muggers. Only when the crowds thinned as the sun began to set, the city watch be able to separate them from their marks and drive them back into their lawless slums. Ludwig ducked the sweep of a chicken farmer as he gawped and gaped at the sights of the city. Forgetting the long pole slung over his back, squawking poultry dangling from it by their tethers, he dodged the carriage of a nobleman as the dignitary rushed through the street, allowing no delay as the traffic parted before his horses. The wheels of the carriage threw up great sheets of muck and mud as they ploughed down the lane. Curses and garbage pelted after the noble as he vanished down the avenue. Ludwig wiped mud from the coat he had used to shield himself, spitting against the cobblestones as he added his own curses to the chorus. The miserable toffs. One day they'd answer for their pomposity and arrogance. The red hand of revolution would rise again, and the great palaces in the imperial quarter would burn. Then the streets would run with blue blood, and the roar of the oppressed would be heard. The little, scrawny man's face grew crimson as emotion welled up inside him, and his hand clenched itself into a fist at his side. Then reason reasserted itself, and Ludwig gave a nervous, hunted look up and down the street, fearful of who might have noticed his momentary loss of control. Paranoia had quietened his revolutionary spirit, deadening his ideals beneath a shroud of fear. Not fear of the politicians or the nobles, not even the witch hunters and their brutal ways. Ludwig was a man who had defied all of them to do their worst and never back down before their threats and violence. His right hand was missing 2 fingers from the time he had been rounded up by the Reichsguard and encouraged to betray his fellow revolutionaries. All they had wrestled from his tongue was the same spittle he'd given the street. It was later, much later, that he discovered true fear. It was when he'd first set eyes on the sinister being he would call master that Ludwig had learned the nature of terror. The Cell of Conspirators, a revolutionary group calling itself the Red Talon, had gathered in the old abandoned manor house of Prince Stefan, planning their own addition to the festivities being arranged to celebrate the birthday of the Emperor. The plotting had not gotten far when the meeting was disturbed by a spectral apparition that seemed to grow out of the darkness. Ludwig was a man of words and ideals, not a fighter, but many within the Red Talon were seasoned warriors, veterans of military campaigns, naval engagements, and underworld skirmishes. Ludwig was to learn much that night, as the violence of that tremendous battle stripped away the mask that had cloaked the true nature of the Red Talon. Many of his fellow revolutionaries were exposed as twisted mutants, hiding their corruption beneath a veneer of normalcy. Their leader, Ulrich Schildenhof, proved to be a disciple of the ruinous powers, a sorcerous agent of the Purple Hand. Lofty principles and fiery rhetoric crumbled beneath the horror and shame of the moment. Ludwig's mind numbed by the guilt of being used as a pawn by such unholy things. Then, his horror was magnified when he saw the lone, shadowy intruder spring into battle with Schildenhof and his inner circle. One man against the awful mutations of a dozen degenerate horrors and the infernal sorcerer whom they served. It should have been a slaughter. It was, but not the way Schildenhof expected. Ludwig could still remember the look of absolute disbelief on the Black Magiter's face as his head rolled across the manor's ceramic floor. The former agitator and rabble-rouser shuddered at the image and hurried on his way. Ludwig had preached to any who would listen about the Emperor's spies and how they were steadily attacking the privacy and dignity of every soul in Altdorf. He had believed his words. Now he knew them for the exaggerated lies that they were. Now he knew what it was like to be watched by a being who did have eyes everywhere. He did not know why he had been spared that night. Perhaps it was because he had been an innocent dupe of the Ring's cultist leadership. Perhaps it was because in him, Jeremiah Scrivener found skills that would be useful to his own organization. For whatever the reason, Ludwig knew it would have been a death sentence to refuse the offer that spectral shadow spoke to him amid the gory shambles of the Red Talon's ruin. The agitator shook his head, trying to dislodge the terrifying memory. He was still not sure if what he had been granted was reprieve or simply deferment. What he was certain of was the folly of delay. His new master did not have much patience for folly. Ludwig saw the darkened doorway of a cellar, its iron-fenced steps climbing to join the level of the street. He fumbled at the pocket of his coat, producing a strange gilded key. His father had been a locksmith, among a dozen other professions, as his family had quietly starved in the squalor of Altdorf's waterfront. But Ludwig had never seen the likes of this key before. He would almost swear that it changed each time he placed it into a lock, an impression that was always as hard to shake as it was to accept. With one last glance over his shoulder, Ludwig darted down the cobblestone steps and pressed his body against the iron-branded cellar door. The key slithered into the bronze lock like the hand into a glove, producing a scratching, clicking sound as it turned the mechanism. He pulled the key out quickly and stuffed it back into his pocket, not daring to look at it, fearful he might notice some change in its shape. Muttering a prayer to Verena, goddess of wisdom and light, Ludwig pulled the door open and ducked inside. His prayer was not answered. Ludwig could tell at once. The cellar was as black as the belly of a demon, not even the feeblest light trickling through its glazed window. As though the day feared to trespass upon this lingering patch of midnight beneath the streets of Altdorf, a cold iciness crawled through his flesh, seeping into his body and numbing his soul. His breath became a frosty whisper as he forced himself to step deeper into the darkness. Somewhere in the gloom, he knew, was a little metal box painted to look like one of the flagstones. Perhaps he would be allowed to place his message in there and withdraw. With what came the hissed command, at once both distant and near. Ludwig shivered as he heard the voice of his master. He fumbled again in the pockets of his coat, drawing the letter he had written with the master's crawling ink. There was no sound, no sense of anyone moving towards him, not even the slightest brush against his hand, yet somehow the sheaf of parchment was plucked from his fingers all the same. Ludwig could hear the parchment crinkle somewhere in the darkness. He could imagine grey eyes of smoke gazing upon those pages as the mind behind them willed the ink to form itself into letters once more. Somehow, he knew that the written words would not be enough. "Johann Dietrich spotted," Ludwig said, forcing the quiver from his voice. I followed him to the shop of Dr. Lucas Philip Lowe, the alchemist. Dietrich remained there for some time. Upon leaving, he pursued an indirect route to the Crown and 2 chairmen. I waited for 3 bells, but he did not emerge from the tavern. At that point, I decided that he was not coming out again and hurried here to make my report. There was silence in the darkness. Silence as thick and menacing as anything Ludwig had experienced in the dungeons of the Emperor. Ludwig knew that a tremendous intellect was digesting his words, twisting and turning them, viewing his accounts from angles Ludwig could neither understand nor fathom. There were some other things it was best not to understand or question. Assume position outside Dr. Lowe's. Observe any visitors. Await further instructions, whispered the voice. Ludwig sketched a deep bow, putting far more sincerity into the gesture than he ever had showed the Emperor or the Grand Diogenes. I obey, the scrawny man whispered. He reached behind him, feeling for the door, his hand closing desperately about the handle. Lingering only a moment to hear his master's cold voice, Ludwig pulled open the door and rushed back into the fading daylight. Behind him, in the perpetual shadow of the cellar, a figure stirred, its footsteps echoing as it too deserted the room, vanishing into the deeper darkness beyond. Seer found that his progress through Clan Moulder's stretch of the scroll was much easier with Bone Ripper's enormity looming beside him. The mutant rat ogre was a creature of some notoriety among the merchants and beastmasters of Clan Moulder. Few of them had failed to see the brute in the clan's fighting pits, tearing through every beast, slave and captive he was pitted against. Besides such gruesome memories, even the fearsome reputation of Skavenblight's elite storm vermin was insignificant. He'd given Cratch the unenviable job of holding onto Bone Ripper's leash. It would take time for the rat ogre to accept his new master, though feeding him the best parts of his previous owner had certainly helped improve the monster's attitude. If Bone Ripper was still hungry, Thanquol felt better with Cratch being the closest thing to him. Being eaten by one's own bodyguard was a terribly silly way for someone of his fame to end his brilliant career. With that in mind, Thanquol glanced at his apprentice. The wretch was once again treacherously lingering behind, stretching Bone Ripper's chain to its full extent. Thanquol snarled a few threats and brought his apprentice sullenly back into place. Selfless, loyal underlings were so very hard to find. Up ahead, Thanquol saw his storm vermin suddenly grow tense. Squeals and frightened squeaks rose from the crowd filling the passageway, the musk of fear rising prominently among the fog of the streets. Skavens scurried and scrambled into shops and dived into slave pens in a maddened, frightened dash for safety. Low chittering howls told the reason for their flight. Thankor snarled at his storm vermin as the two albinos shared an anxious glance, then retreated behind the bulk of Bone Ripper. As an afterthought, he grabbed Cratch by the shoulders. He wasn't forgetting that the rat ogre might still be hungry. A heavy, stagnant smell assaulted Thankor's nose, a reek of beasts and blood, rat-like yet lacking the pleasantness of a purely rodent scent. Loping into view a few moments later was the source of a scent. A thrill of terror ran through Thankor's glands as he saw the crouched shape, thinking for a moment that the rat beast had somehow returned to hunt him down. It took only an instant to realize that the creature he gazed upon was much smaller, only about twice the size of a Skaven. It was more dog-like than rat-like, with a broad build and powerful square-set jaws. The hand-like paws and long scaly tail were distinctly rat-like, however, and when it sniffed the air, it lifted its body in the fashion of a rat rather than sniffing the ground like a dog. It was a wolf rat, one of Clan Moulder's loathsome creations, a fearsome, barely tractable beast bred for those warlords and degenerates for whom the usual strains of giant rat and mole were not large enough. Thankwell grinned savagely, pushing Cratch away and cuffing the apprentice for observing his moment of fear. Formidable as a wolf rat might be for a lone Skaven, Thankwell was anything but alone. Then the wolf rat caught his scent. It stared straight at him, singling the grey seer from among his guards. It was an unsettling moment, made worse when the animal uttered another of its chittering howls. Instantly, other shapes loped into view, first one, and then another. Before Thankwell could even twitch a whisker, a half-dozen of the mutant beasts filled the tunnel ahead. "Stand fight!" Thankwell snarled as his storm vermin started to back away. They looked at him, eyes wide with alarm. Thankwell raised his staff threateningly. "Stand fight, or burn, burn!" Then there was no more time for threats and commands. Howling, the wolf rats bounded down the tunnel, foam dripping from their jaws, their eyes still locked on the robed figure of the grey seer. Thankwell forced his eyes shut, focusing his mind on the power of the horned rat. A green glow glamored about his staff. Opening his eyes again, he sent a bolt of shimmering energy crashing into the oncoming pack. One of the wolf rats yelped, crumbling as the bolt struck it. Smoke rose from its singed fur, blood dripping from its mangled body as it dragged itself away across the floor of the tunnel. The other wolf rats kept coming. They struck the position of the storm vermin like a furry avalanche. Each of the white-furred warriors lashed out, their halberds flashing like scythes through the beasts, slashing their flesh and splitting their bones. Any lesser Skaven would have been overwhelmed on the instant by such adversaries. The elite warriors from Skaven Blight managed the impossible. They managed to hold their ground long enough for Thankwell to draw upon his powers once more. The temptation to nibble a piece of warpstone flashed through Thankwell's mind, but the hazard, the way he had lost control, was too fresh in his memory for him to weaken to it. Instead, he concentrated and evoked the might of the horned rat once more. Another bolt of energy, this time smashing into a pair of wolf rats as they swarmed over one of his storm vermin. The blast incinerated all three, engulfing them in burning, roaring malignance that scorched the fur from the flesh and melted the marrow in their bones. Thankwell was certain the beleaguered warrior died happy, knowing his sacrifice had destroyed two of the Grey Seer's enemies. The other storm vermin was not so diligent about delaying the Grey Seer's foes. Occupied with one wolf rat, the warrior allowed the other two to get past him, the beast heading straight for Thanquol. No time for concentration now. Thanquol grabbed one of the warpstone tokens, raising it to his muzzle. He was suddenly struck violently from behind, the nugget of warpstone flying from his paw. Thanquol dived after it, scrambling to recover it. Too late, he realized the mistake of his instinctive dive for the errant warpstone. Thanquol lifted his horned head to see both of the wolf rats diving down upon him. Their dripping jaws flashed, their clawed paws slashed at the earthen floor. As one, the beasts leapt, pouncing upon their prey. Thanquol covered his head and cursed anything and everything he could think of. Stabbing teeth and slashing paws never touched Thanquol's fur. The grey seer uncovered his head and looked up in disbelief. Towering above him was Bone Ripper, and in two of the rat ogre's immense paws he held a struggling wolf rat. The brute seemed oblivious to the jaws that snapped at his fingers, at the paws that slashed at his chest. With a dull, disinterested look, he simply stared at the animals, almost as though trying to figure out what they were. Thanquol understood now. In his diatribe against all Skavendom, he must have squealed Bone Ripper's name. That rat ogre had reacted with admirable speed, rallying to his master's defense. Even in so short a time, he had accepted both his new name and his new master. Surely another sign that the beast had been gifted to Thanquol by the horned rat himself. The grey seer looked up at his bodyguard and the struggling wolf rats in his paws. He looked down the tunnel to where the last storm vermin was just finishing off his opponent with a stab of his halberd into its throat. Thanquol looked back at Bone Ripper, determined the rat ogre could do better. "Bone Ripper," he called, pleased when the brute fixed his dull gaze on the grey seer. Thanquol made a snapping motion with his paw. "Rip-tear," he snarled. "Rip-tear." Bone Ripper nodded. A loathsome human gesture he must have been taught by Shafwit's decadent human mannerisms, but instead of ripping apart the wolf rats, the rat ogre began to squeeze. Tighter and tighter his paws closed, ignoring the desperate spasms of terror from his captives. Thanquol could hear bones crack beneath the pressure, then a hideous squish as the heads of both animals popped from their necks. It wasn't what he had had in mind, but he was reasonably satisfied with the results. As a reward, Thanquol allowed Bone Ripper to settle down onto his haunches and start to feed off the carrion.
Master, you are safe well? No pain, hurt?
Thanquol's claws tapped the hilt of his sword. Then he reminded himself that he might still need Cratch. For prudence, he'd have to dismiss that treacherous shove from behind as an innocent accident. "Be more careful, fool flesh," Thanquol snapped, contenting himself with swatting Cratch's snout with his staff. A quick investigation further up the tunnel found a dead clan moulder merchant inside a shop with an empty kennel. A scrap of the grey seer's old robe, the one soiled during the fight in Clan Moore's Warren, was clutched in the dead traitor's paw. Having failed with Clan Eshin's gutter runners, Thanquol's enemies in Under-Altdorf had turned to Clan Moulder's beasts. He didn't like to think what their next trick might be. Perhaps he would spend a few more of the council's warpstone tokens after all. Thanquol snapped a curt order to Cratch and the last of his storm vermin. They would head for the armor shops of Clan Moors. Thanquol would feel a bit better with something heavier than his fur standing between himself and a stab in the dark. Then perhaps they could visit the temple again and collect some protective charms and amulets. just in case his enemies decided to use something less physical than a knife or rat. Dr. Lowe descended the stairs that connected his living quarters with his shop, taking extra care to step only upon the thickly carpeted centre of the stairway so that his footfalls might be muffled. One of the alchemist's hands was wrapped about the handle of a heavy ceramic pestle, holding the tool after the fashion of a horseman's mace, while the other hand clutched the glass neck of a more grisly weapon, a powerful acid derived from vitriol and troll vomit. He paused in his descent, cocking his head in a wary, watchful manner. His senses strained on the gloom of his darkened shop, waiting for any betraying sound to again reach his ears. It had been many years since any of the scum of the waterfront had been bold enough to try and rob him. Lowe was determined to make an example of this clumsy burglar. The sound came again, a scratching rattle from the direction of his workroom. The alchemist's expression grew vicious. It was trespass enough to try and steal his wares, but to disturb his experiments was a violation he would not forgive. As the sounds continued, Lowe's pace quickened, caution cast aside in his anger. He pushed through the darkness, rushing past the shadowy shelves of bottles and potions towards the curtain that separated workroom from shop. Abruptly, the alchemist froze, every sense afire with alarm. Before him, the shadows seemed to reach out, to assume a solidity of shape and form. Something was standing between him and the curtain, something that seemed to mock his efforts to see it. Lowe started to lift the bottle of acid, but a frightened chill that had nothing to do with sudden coldness of the room arrested the motion. From the darkness, a voice hissed at him. "Return to your bed," the whisper warned him. "There is nothing to find here except death." There was a fearful menace in that voice, a nightmarish air of unreality that made even the alchemist pale as he heard it. Lowe took a few stumbling steps back almost before he was aware of his own retreat. Remembering the sounds that had drawn him downstairs, remembering what it was he had left in this workroom, the alchemist drew upon his own miserly greed to put steel in his spine.
"Who are you to order me around in my own home?"
Lowe snarled indignantly.
"I'll settle with you, be you ghost or phantom."
He started to raise the heavy pestle for a strike at the patch of thick darkness where he judged the whisper to have emanated. Suddenly, the darkness lessened, fading away and exposing what it had concealed. The pestle dropped from nerveless fingers. Tall, swathed in the heavy folds of a charcoal-grey cloak, his head hidden beneath the shadow of a deep hood, his face muffled beneath a thick grey staff. All that Lowe could see was a sharp, hawk-like nose and a pair of smoky grey eyes. The alchemist's willpower was trapped by the intense stare of those eyes, swirling pools of darkness that drew him into their formless depths. There was power in that chill gaze, power beyond that of hypnotist and the street corner mystic. Lowe could feel the icy touch of the arcane world in those eyes. The sinister apparition raised a hand swathed in black, motioning for silence from the stunned alchemist. "Preserve your life. Forget what was brought to you," the shade's hissing voice told Lowe. A sound from beyond the curtain, louder than anything Lowe had heard before, broke the hypnotic spell that had started to numb his mind. The alchemist tore his eyes away from the smoky pits of the apparition's hidden face, rushing past the menacing darkness and seizing the curtain in a trembling hand. With a snarl of defiance, Lowe ripped away the curtain, ready to confront the burglar who had violated his workroom. For the second time, Dr. Lowe was confronted by a sight that drained the strength from his spine. The alchemist's retreat was more rapid than before, his terror impossibly even greater than when he had been confronted by the cloaked wraith in his shop. What was rummaging about his workroom was no burglar, at least no human burglar. It was a gigantic feral thing, its general shape that of some enormous vermin. A great swathe of scorched, crusty hide stretched along its side from the side of its snout to the tip of its tail. The ugly wound still dripping a filthy blue treacle that sizzled as it struck the floor. As Lowe gasped in horror, the rat beast swung its head around, fixing the alchemist with its beady red eyes. With a low, chittering growl, the monster began to stalk after the terrified man, its fangs gleaming like daggers in the gloom. And here you have it. That was the end of Chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to speaking to you all again very soon. Take care. Goodbye.